morning, everybody. It's lovely to see you again this Sunday. And today we're going to be continuing with our series that Sophie started for us yesterday on Judges. Our passage today is Judges 2, verse 6 to Judges 3, verse 6. So if you have a Bible and want to follow it, then please do, or if it's on one of your devices, but do settle down and I'll read it for us. It's fairly long, not massively long, but it is fairly long. So please do get a cup of tea or coffee or whatever it is. Press pause. When you're ready, start again. So here we go. Judges 2 verse 6 through to Judges 3 verse 6. After Joshua had dismissed the Israelites, they went to take possession of the land, each to their own inheritance. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him, and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110, and they buried him in the land of his inheritance, at Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. After that, the whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors. Another generation grew up, who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. They aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges, who saved them out of the hands of those raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. They quickly turned away from the ways of their ancestors, who had been obedient to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshipping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and said, "Because this nation has violated the covenant I ordained for their ancestors and has not listened to me, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I will ask them to test Israel and see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it as their ancestors did." The Lord had allowed those nations to remain. He did not drive them out at once by giving them into the hands of Joshua. These are the nations the Lord left to test all those Israelites who had not experienced any of the wars in Canaan. He did this only to teach warfare to the descendants of the Israelites who had not had previous battle experience. The 5 rulers of the Philistines, all the Canaanites, the Sidonians, and the Hivites living in the Lebanon mountains from Mount Baal Hermon to Lebo Hamath. They were left to test the Israelites, to see whether they would obey the Lord's commands which he had given their ancestors through Moses. The Israelites lived among the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. They took their daughters in marriage and gave their own daughters to their sons and served their gods. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So, as I said, welcome back to our series on Judges, and Sophie kicked us off last week with an excellent introduction. But if you're eager now to jump into the action around the main characters of the book, like Gideon, for example, or Deborah, or Samson, and the others, then I'm afraid we've got to wait one more week before meeting the first judges, who are going to be Othniel and Ehud. And the reason why is because the structure of the book is such that effectively the prologue is in two parts. There are two prefaces to the historical narrative. And our passage today is the second such introductory passage, a second preface. Now, I have to say, in preparing these talks, we've been helped a lot by Tim Keller's study on Judges. And there are a number of other excellent commentaries as well. So if you would look to sort of deepening your involvement and your understanding of this book, can I recommend both Tim Keller and one or two other commentaries to you? And if you'd like to know which ones, then give me a call or send me an email, and I'd love to discuss that with you. Judges is really a mesmerizing book, because it mirrors so much that can go wrong in human character. And therefore, so much that can go wrong in the relationship between God and his people. And the protagonists of this book, the judges themselves, they're deeply flawed, many of them. There's idolatry, there's thievery, there's lust, there's envy, there's murder, there's rape, there's violence. Not just amongst the people of Israel, but even in the characters of their judges. And these judges are not there, they're not really wearing a wig or sitting on a bench. They're not there basically to settle disputes and preserve harmony in and amongst the tribes of Israel. It's not about them being the arbiters of community living. Actually, what happens is they are the leaders who engage in the struggle to really take the promised land, this land of Canaan, as God had wished for his people. I mean, God's initial wish was that Canaan would be entirely peopled by the people of Israel, by his people. And this would become kind of like, I don't want to say the word showcase, but it would be a demonstration of how people can live at peace with one another and with God. But this isn't what happened. And so in Judges, we see some sporadic flashes of brilliance amongst those leaders, amongst the judges, but also many, many long periods of, I'd say, fruitless time wasting and even kind of destructive activity. The people of Israel, they lose their sense of purpose. They lose their identity as a people of God again and again and again, and they get trapped in this spiral that goes down. And repeatedly they show how one can lose one's moral compass, how one can abandon one's spiritual anchor, the safety of that anchorage, how one can fall out of having a proper relationship with God. If you were to fast forward to the very last phrase at the end of the book of Judges, it sums it all up, I think. It says, they all did as they saw fit. Everyone just did what they wanted. Not as God saw fit, but as they saw fit. And if the first part of the prologue, what Sophie introduced to us last week, is a confession, a general confession of failure and setbacks, the second part of the prologue, so say 1b if you wish, is more theological reflective. It connects back in a way. It reminds us of the commands that we see in Deuteronomy 6. So anyway, the action starts in our passage by referring to Joshua. And Joshua was the leader who followed on from Moses. Remember how it was only Joshua and Caleb who were able in the Exodus narrative to enter the promised land, to actually enter into Canaan. And Joshua was a leader who'd experienced God's interventions. He'd seen what God had done for his people. It talks about all the great things the Lord has done for Israel in verse 7. He'd served well. He had entered into the land of his inheritance as promised, and he had died in the land of his inheritance at a great age. Look at verses 8 and 9. But already, already, even under this leader, things had not gone totally according to plan. And each tribe of Israel had individually attempted to carve out for itself its bit of the promised land, to get established in a particular area, with varying degrees of success, because Israel were already becoming disunited as a people. They were, technically speaking, they were unfamiliar with the use of chariots, if you wish. They found themselves eventually confined to hilltops, and the Canaanites were down in the valleys that, of course, divided the hill country. So this is a people that are already divided because they did not come together to establish how it could be that as a united people, they could undertake what God has asked them to do. And once Joshua dies, then things really start to slide. Things haven't gone according to plan, but now that he's dead, things go really quite rapidly worse. And the generation that follows forsakes the saving work of God among them, and certainly among their ancestors. It's not to say, I think, that they were ignorant of the historical narrative. I think it was more that the Passover epic journey had been wiped from memory as an act of God's salvation. What was erased was the value, the worthship, therefore the worship in the relationship of the people and the Lord God. Does that strike a little bit of resonance to us today? How do people think about Easter? In general, do people think about Easter and say, the Easter bunny is going to bring me a present? Or do they think about the cross and the resurrection? What percentage think what? It's an interesting reflection, maybe something that you can chat about later on, though it's not one of my questions. So Thanksgiving was no longer a part of the language of these people. If the journey from Egypt and through the Red Sea was remembered, its significance was not, or at least its significance was not honoured, and its architect was therefore dishonoured. And I can understand God being not pleased with that, being angry. And once that step of dishonouring God had been taken, then it was just a simple step to the next situation, if you wish, which was the worship of other gods with a small g, turning to the Baals, the lords of the place. What do we think happened from one generation to the next? This was only over one generation. What do we think happened? Well, I'd say there was a distancing from God. The Israelites moved from having what I would say was a semi-detached attitude towards God. That's in verse 2, when they're kind of, looking back at last week, God's telling his people, you haven't followed me, you've disobeyed me. But they don't really respond to that in a very constructive way, are they? They're becoming semi-detached from him. And now the new generation is moving to a place of total denial. And so it's easy to think, I want to explore whose fault that is. And of course, there's kind of two extremes here, aren't there? You could say that it's the fault of the older generation. The older generation failed to properly acknowledge to the younger generation the role that God had played amongst them, or failed to diligently instill in them a knowledge of the significance of God's actions for them. That the parting of the Red Sea wasn't just a sort of ooh-ah moment of miracle, but had a much deeper significance. I think that they maybe shied away from repeating personal testimony. And maybe they sort of tripped into the landscape of rites and ceremonies for the sake of rites and ceremonies rather than for the deep underlying meaning. So that's maybe a fault of the older generation. And the younger generation, what about them? Well, maybe they were more cynical. Maybe they were more attracted to, I don't know, to the visible, glittering idols than to this sort of nebulous person who's spoken about in dusty papyruses or papyri, or whatever the right word is, the God of their parents and godparents. Maybe the here and the now and the glitzy was far more attractional. Not an unfamiliar scenario, I imagine, to us today. I imagine that the truth is somewhere between those two extremes. That, there was a sort of laxity, if you wish, in the older generation, and there was a general indifference maybe in the younger generation as they grappled with the immediate and sort of gave up on the transcendental nature of their God. And so it's so easy, isn't it, to pass from the commitment, the immediacy, the engagement of commitment to God because of personal experience or knowledge, to lip service of just being a nominal follower of God's, to finally ending up pretty compromised and eventually disconnected in terms of faith. But nestled in the text is a plea, I think, a plea to remember what needs to be done in order for faith to be kept alive from one generation to the other. And I think that this is a sort of subliminal reference to Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 to 9. I'm not going to read those now, but I'm going to encourage you between now and when we get together to discuss, to have a look at just that short paragraph. God's people are to have God's commandments on their hearts, not just in their minds, not just to read about these commandments or hear these commandments, to actually do and respond to these commandments. Not to be inconsistent, not to just put on an outward show and have a different internal landscape, but and not only to do this on the days of worship, if you wish, but to do this in everyday activity. The text in Deuteronomy talks about when you're walking around, when you're sitting down, when you're doing your chores, so to speak. In the routine of daily life, you are to love God and to have His commandments on your hearts. And then towards the end of chapter 6, in verse 25, I think it speaks of the consequences of disobedience. And the consequences of following. And the consequences of following, if we are careful to obey, says the text, that will be our righteousness. That will be our good, encouraging, loving relationship with God restored or set on the right footing. Our passage in verses 10 to 13, it just charts a sad cycle of breakdown and of failure in the relationship of Israel with God. And this cycle is something that we see again and again and again. It's a cautionary tale, really. So what happens is the people of God move away from Him. They rebel. They start worshipping other things, idols, and they forget His acts of salvation. So they move away. And what this then leads to, it provokes God's anger. Because they've set up human constructs to replace Him. They've kind of written Him out of the script and replaced Him with something that is completely false, counterfeit, and of no worth. And I can imagine, for myself as a parent, if that would have been the attitude of my child, I think I would have been hurt, I would have been surprised, I would have hoped for something better, but eventually I think there would have been a deep anger within me as well. So God gets angry. And the result is that God doesn't intervene when the indigenous people of that part of the Middle East, they resist Israel and they have success. And Israel find themselves on the losing side in this struggle, time and time and time again, to great discomfort, to pain, to loss, to to a complete sense of what are we doing here in this land that was promised to us. The enemy gets the upper hand, and this means the lesson here is idolatry leads to slavery. That's what happens for the Israelites. Idolatry leads to slavery. They become the slaves of the very people whose idols they have turned to and started worshipping. Really ironic, isn't it? But then, next phase in the cycle, the next phase is that in their great distress, they groan and they repent. They cry out for God, basically. They realize from a distant, maybe folk memory, whatever it is, they realize that there is somebody to whom they can turn in their moment of anguish with the hope of salvation. So they groan in their distress towards God and they cry out, I imagine, to Him. And as a result, the next stage in this cycle is the Lord wants to lead His people out of their predicament. And so He sends somebody who is His agent, if you wish, in that moment of leading them out. This is the judge. And time again, He will send a judge. But we know what happens. We know that the story is that while the judge is alive, yes, maybe there's a respite, but it's all sort of on the surface, isn't it? Because the moment the judge dies, the people turn back to this idolatry. They turn back to these false gods. They engage in acts of disobedience. And so they sink down further and further and further. And this cycle repeats itself in Judges. And we'll see this passage, this cycle again and again in the passages as we go through this book. But I want to say, let's not get depressed. Let's not get depressed. In every generation, the memory of God remains. It remains alive. The memory of what a proper relationship with Him might entail, that remains alive. The memory of the possibility of redemption, that remains alive even in times of desperation. Those memories remain alive. And, turning back to look to people who've come before us and who in adversity have displayed their commitment. I mean, it's a powerful testimony. And maybe that's something that had lingered in the consciousness of the Israelites. Powerful testimony of generations that have gone before. I've been so struck by Captain Tom Moore, and I guess so many of us have, this 99-year-old soldier who has, in a sense of duty really, but also out of compassion, decided to walk around his garden 100 times with his Zimmer frame, and has raised well over £20 million for the NHS. And I've wondered what's going on here. I mean, I know superficially what's going on is that people are tuning in to the sort of love for and care for the NHS and its amazing people, the nurses, the doctors, everybody else who's engaged in caring. And in fact, not just the NHS, but anybody who's a carer. And they've wanted to display their compassion for this group of people. And Captain Tom, in a way, has offered them a conduit for this display. And so they've given so generously. But I think there's something else happening here. I think there's something cross-generational. I think we're looking back and we're seeing a man who's near 100 years old. And it could have been a woman, but we're seeing this person who's 100 years old, and he has reminded us of a particular example of commitment that is laudable in its simplicity and its singularity of purpose. This commitment that has led him to undertake an activity that is vicarious in a way because he's doing it on others' behalf as well, and that is costly to him because he's not exactly sprinting around his garden. And I think that sort of sparks something in the following generations. I think that as younger people turn back to look at Captain Tom, they'll say, here's a way of approaching life, of approaching community, of approaching offering ourselves that resonates with me. And ultimately there can be a model, and which itself is modeled on something even greater. I don't want to read too much into Captain Tom's spiritual life, and I'm not going to, but it certainly set me thinking. So how are we responding? How are we responding to this cycle when we become aware of it? How are we responding to the call to be different? How are we responding to the call to proclaim Christ in these times and in these days of Corona? How can we demonstrate our faith in God's power to redeem and to restore and, yes, eventually to rebuild? So I want to suggest as we end that as we ponder some of these major questions, I wanted to say, don't be distressed, because the book of Judges, it's not a book about the judges themselves, even though it's called Judges. They're flawed. I mean, we see their actions, but they are flawed people. And it's not a book either about the people of Israel, nor about the promised land, Canaan, and the struggle to inhabit it. It's not about that either. This is a book about God's loving grace and his measureless and repeated acts of providence for us. That's what this book is about. This book is about what God does for people that again and again demonstrate their fractiousness, their fragility, their failure. It's a book about God. So I'd like to suggest that we draw stumps there as we prepare next week to launch into the actual historical narrative itself. But we're going to meet up at 11 o'clock, I hope, many of us, and go into our breakout rooms and chat. I so much enjoyed doing that the last week and the week before. So here are a couple of questions, 2 or 3 questions for us to ponder. How do we pass on our faith to the younger generation? Today, this is key, as it was then. We see things like knife crime, we see youth unemployment, we see all that around us. How can we pass our faith to the younger generation? It's part of the strand of our mission action plan. Secondly, has there been a judge's cycle in your own Christian life? Have you gone through that cycle that I described of rebellion and then things going wrong, and then calling upon God, and then God doing something for us amazing, and then that wearing off, and then maybe back into the cycle? How do you respond? And here's a third question for us. As a Christian, what would you want to be your spiritual epitaph? This is a question that Tim Keller puts in his book. What would you want your spiritual epitaph to be as a Christian? So thanks for listening, and see you at 11 o'clock. Bye-bye.